This is the worst.
These videos are not for children. If you are a children, then piss off.
Hey there, I'm Infuso, and The Office is one of the most beloved and rewatchable TV series in all of sitcom history. However, it wasn't always that way. You see, the US Office spent its first season trying its best to mimic and duplicate the first series of the UK Office, and it pretty much failed miserably, as some predicted it would. I'm sure a lot of you have heard the story of gym actor John Krasinski almost completely blowing his audition by stating that he hoped the producers didn't wind up screwing the show up, as most British adapted American sitcoms have been known to do. And he said this in front of one of the producers, not knowing that he was one of the producers. And he was kinda spot on. The show did kinda screw up the UK Office. Wait, hold on. Hear me out. Obviously, The Office is a complete juggernaut. A series that will stand the test of time even if some of its jokes don't. It's given its watchers unforgettable characters, incredible moments, awesome and awful romances, iconic feuds, and countless memes. But the first 6 episodes? Not so much. The entire first season feels like an extended pilot of the series. The show is still obviously trying to find its footing, and it's in a pretty awkward place of both trying to pay homage to Ricky Gervais's series, but also still trying to establish it as its own by relating it more to American audiences. And in replicating the original British show, The American Office came off as a poor second-rate carbon copy of its predecessor. The American Office's first season is kinda like the dollar store UK version of something. It's like when you go to the store and you're like, oh shit, Cheerios! And your mom's like, no, I'm sorry honey, we have them at home. And at home, there ain't no goddamn Honey Nut Cheerios here, but hey, we got Honey Oats, it's the same thing, right? You know, maybe that's a bad comparison because I actually kinda always preferred the bargain brand ones. I don't know what it is, it tastes better, I think. But that's not the point. If anything, it's the exact opposite of the point. I'm just getting distracted because I am an adult suffering from ADD. Anyway, in trying to recreate the original Office, the show kind of immediately took a nosedive. Not too dissimilar to a friend of mine, as some of you who watch this channel may remember. This version of The Office wasn't as funny as the UK Office. Hell, the two weren't even comparable. Other than, you know, a lot of the same scenes happened in one and then happened in the other. I guess you could compare them. But, like, you know, why would you? Because it's not fair. It's like you see a kid outside, he's playing basketball, and you're like, this kid ain't no Michael Jordan. Come on, put the ball down. You will never be LeBron. Michael Scott's Office just couldn't match up to David Brent's Office. And even trying kind of felt like a meaningless effort. However, by the time the next season came around, a lot of that, if not all of that, changed. There's a very clear evolution of the brand going from Season 1 into Season 2. The characters, most of which come off as bland and mundane in the first season, begin to gain their own unique voices and personalities along with it. Michael, while still equally oblivious and obnoxious, as he was the season prior, in Season 2 he becomes a lot more likable and is now positioned not as a sleazy boss, but as a completely inept human being constantly in over his head. But this Michael Scott is still trying his best. There's a very obvious tonal shift as well. No longer looking to recreate the realistic, somewhat boring work lives a paper salesman might lead, The Office is now establishing itself as a place of fun. Granted, maybe not for the workers, but for us, the viewers. And this is where the show really began to succeed. When The Office stopped trying to Americanize this older show, and instead just took the basis of the original and then built upon its foundation with their own material. Now recreating the entire show in Steve Carell's image. And this was a pretty good decision. In my opinion, the show only took off after it established a separate identity from its source material. And for a lot of watchers in doing so, it actually wound up completely eclipsing the original in terms of longevity, lifespan, and overall enjoyability. They found their way in getting away from real and embracing fantasy. Suddenly the show became much more outlandish. While it's still grounded in reality in terms of setting and rules, the characters practically come off as live-action cartoon characters. Michael is now an outsider looking in any and all situations. He acts as if he's never interacted with a human being before but is desperate to do so and befriend them. This is also despite his job pretty much requiring that he speaks to people on a day-to-day basis. Kevin has become unreasonably stupid, and that will continue for the rest of the series. It's just a downhill slope. Season 1, Kevin? Maybe a little bit dumb, maybe, not even clarified there. But Season 9, Kevin? I'm not sure that guy even could spell his name. I know he can't do his taxes. Angela all of a sudden becomes a holier-than-thou crazy cat lady. Dwight becomes a country bumpkin beet farmer who, like Michael, comes off as someone who has never really been socially conditioned. Creed becomes... Creed? I don't even know how to put that. He's kind of like a shady background weirdo. Like, it's obvious, but you constantly overlook him. Though maybe you shouldn't. That doesn't seem like somebody I'd want to take my eyes off, personally. These changes completely reinvented and revitalized the series. And I have no doubt in my mind that this actually saved the whole show. I have a really hard time believing that this show would have lasted almost a full decade had they stuck to their original premise and the United Kingdom show's original blueprint. I mean, Ricky Gervais did that, and how long did his show last? What, 2 seasons? 12 episodes? It's a joke. It's a joke, guys. Relax. The UK office is obviously great, and without it we wouldn't have the American show, and blah 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 blah. But I don't think the US office would be as successful as it is today had they not made these changes early on. And to be honest with you, and this might be an unpopular opinion, I'm sure a lot of you are going to disagree with me. As a matter of fact, some of you may be so turned off by this next statement that you just immediately unsubscribe. And you know what? That's fine. It's there for a reason. You can do that anytime you like. But I'm going to be honest here. I have an easier time sitting down and watching the last 2 seasons of the show than I do in its very first season. Because even though the last 2 seasons aren't necessarily great, I actually do still kind of like Season 8. Season 9 is not necessarily great. It still feels like The Office. We still know the characters, and for the most part, it still has that same energy behind it. You're still able to laugh at Creed, or realize later in life that you relate the most to Stanley. That man just wants to go to work, get a paycheck, go to sleep. That's all he wants. But in Season 1, we don't have a grasp for a lot of these characters. In Season 1, it portrays a lot of the ones that we do understand in a really negative light. Which, of course, again, is rectified later on. But my point is, the first season of the show is almost like a prelude to the rest of its run. It was only just finding its identity. So in my opinion, The Office's first season is its worst season. It wasn't actually necessarily bad, but it's definitely a far cry from The Office we all know and love. And you can take that any way you want, because it's a far cry from The Office we know and love if you're an American fan, and it's a far cry from The Office you know and love if you're a United Kingdom fan. It's like in this strange purgatory in between those 2 shows. It's a very gray area. I'm not even kidding when I say that either, because when I go back and I binge watch this series, which I'm sure I'm gonna have to do again at some point on this channel, because it's just the way that it goes, I almost always skip the first season. Again, it's not because it's bad, but it's just because it isn't The Office that I know. So with that being said, I'm opening the floodgates of criticism here. I'm sure everyone's gonna have something to say. A lot of it ain't gonna be good. A lot of it ain't gonna be agreeing with me, but this is my opinion. And now it's on the internet forever, so that's great. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, but if you didn't, well, I'm probably gonna hear about it anyway, so have a good one.
My ears are ringing. Hi.
Hi.
I'm Leslie Knope.
Hi.
I'm the Deputy Director of Parks and Recreation.
Hey there, it's me, your least favorite YouTuber, Infuso. Here to talk to you about one of my all-time favorite TV shows, and one of my all-time least favorite seasons of one of my all-time favorite TV shows, Parks and Recreation. Man, did you have a hell of a run. 7 seasons, most of them good, but unfortunately, we're not here to talk about any of those. We're not talking about Parks and Rec when it was at its prime. Oh no. Because in order to get to that, we must first talk about the show when it was at its lowest. I'm talking, of course, about Parks and Recreation's first season. Now, I think it's pretty obvious to most people who've sat through the show just how much it changed going from one season into the next. And yeah, sure, when it comes to TV, changes can be expected over time. The changes that are made are usually made in order to make the show feel new and fresh, or at the very least, just slightly less old. But going from the first season into the second season, there was a whole lot of change and not a whole lot of time to show that change. That's why previously when I spoke about the George Lopez show, I mentioned that all of its characters felt like the characters immediately. It's a strange statement until you see shows like this and realize how far off the mark they were before they met their core fan base. Now when it comes to Parks and Rec, bringing up The Office is unavoidable. Both are workplace comedies shot mockumentary style. To say that these two shows are from the same creative tree would be a little bit of an understatement considering they also share a creator. So it's obvious that this show was made to capitalize off the rabid Office fanbase. But in trying to recreate the magic of The Office, they accidentally recreated the first big mistake that show made. Ironically enough, the first season of The Office sucks because it's the show attempting to be a second-rate version of the UK Office. They're not really making any changes to it, they're just doing what came before, slightly worse. And in that same vein, the first season of Parks and Recreation sucks because it's attempting to be a second-rate version of the US Office. Early on, they seemed very driven to follow in the same path of its predecessor. Thankfully, over time, they would instead take the road less traveled, thus making a much more original and memorable show, but there's no denying that The Office is in the DNA of this show. In the first season of the show, Leslie Knope comes across as a gender swap to Michael Scott. And sure, there's a comparison that could be made between these two characters even later on, but at least there would be significantly more to contrast. Season 1 Leslie just comes off as a complete rip-off of The World's Best Boss. The first season doesn't showcase Leslie's intelligence or her strength or her skills. Instead, it puts a hyper-focus on her passion, and makes it feel like it borders more on the line of obsession. Her antics over her aspirations make the character come off as ineffective and silly, which I think is a poor impression of the finalized character. Because Leslie could absolutely be all of those things. She could be over-the-top intense, but her enthusiasm isn't entirely unwarranted. She loves what she does, and she goes above and beyond to get what needs to be done. I don't think these few episodes are an inaccurate portrayal of the character exactly, but it does just feel like it only speaks to one side of the character, and you're really not getting a full picture of who she is. The things Leslie's passionate about are her position in the Pawnee government, this one guy Mark that she had a one-night stand with 5 years ago, very important, don't forget it. Yeah, this guy. Yeah, I know, I don't get it either. And lastly, her new friendship with Rashida Jones, which is understandable because Rashida Jones is kinda dope. Ann Perkins shows up as a completely blank slate. I don't know what sparks the friendship between Ann and Leslie. I don't know why Leslie is so deeply attached to her instantaneously. I don't know how she becomes such a huge part of the show. I've watched this first season several times over, and I don't have the answers to any of those questions. All of that doesn't really make much sense to me. And it makes even less sense that the character isn't really given a character of her own at first. She simply exists to create a contrast to Leslie's over-the-top actions, and also to take care of her loser boyfriend. But outside of that, that's really it. And that's not so much a character as it is a character's relationship to other characters. So, if I had to try to describe this character on her own, I don't think that I would, because it wouldn't even be worth the attempt. If this season did a bad job of introducing us to its lead, well, hey, at least she was actually introduced. We may not know that character the way that we'll know that character later on, but at least we're in touch with one side of the character. In terms of Anne, we don't really get that much time to know her. She just shows up and now suddenly she's an accessory to all of Leslie's shenanigans. Her position is now that of a permanent +1 to problems that don't involve her. The rest of the characters, while present, aren't really worth taking note of. They factor into so little of the season that I'm currently acknowledging them more than the actual show does. They're not often thought of, and a lot of the time, they come off more as extras with occasional lines. Yeah, this wasn't exactly an ensemble cast. More importantly, the characters themselves don't feel fleshed out at all. Not only are they not yet the characters that we know them to be, but they weren't even on track to becoming those characters. In Season 1, Tom is a creepy, if not somewhat boring character. He doesn't really have a whole lot of passion for anything that he does, and he's always low energy. And contrast that to the obliviously optimistic, high in hopes and energy Tom that is present throughout the rest of the show. It's hard to even compare these two characters, and it's the same character. But in Season 1, he's so nonchalant in delivery, and the way that he constantly mugs for the camera when Leslie says something strange makes me wonder if he was originally intended to be the Jim to her Michael Scott. Then you have Ron Swanson, the symbol of anti-establishment. In this season, the guy talks the talk, but it doesn't really seem like he walks the walk. He speaks like the character, but he doesn't necessarily look like the character. I don't know, it just feels almost wrong seeing Ron Swanson dressed up in a suit and tie. A look he dropped next season along with his comb-over hair. Like, this is really jarring. And it's not so much the change in looks, but the fact that his original look is the antithesis of this character. Like I said, luckily it was changed the next season, but looking back on it now, I don't know, it just doesn't feel right. I feel like my eyes are deceiving me. Donna really doesn't have a presence whatsoever in season 1. She's there, but it's to be seen, not heard. Not only does she not have any personality, so to speak, but she also barely has any lines of dialogue whatsoever. She also doesn't look like herself. I don't know what they were going for here, but I'm kind of glad it didn't stick. It just didn't suit her. Jerry also similarly doesn't get a whole lot to do this season. Not that anybody's complaining about that, I'm just stating. I think one of the biggest changes, though, has to come from Chris Pratt's Andy. While Andy is always depicted as an obnoxious oaf and oblivious man-child, in the first season he's shown to be much more of a jerk rather than a lovable loser. As a matter of fact, for the most part, his redeemable qualities are non-existent. The show wasn't trying to make him a dope who is down on his luck. Instead, he was presented as Anne's useless boyfriend who's constantly taking advantage of her kindness. But I think the biggest change of Parks and Rec's first season has to come from the character of Mark. Mark was portrayed as being Leslie's love interest, who wasn't all that interested in her love. The show kept commenting on how awesome Mark was and how allegedly irresistible he was to women, but, like, how? How did you, and more importantly, why did you try to make an NPC a series lead? It's very clear from looking at this man that he is not a main character. I mean, if this was a Hallmark movie, I'd look past it. He'd fit right in there. He could be whatever he wants in one of those movies. But this is not a fully fleshed out character. This is like the starter created character you get in video games before you add details onto it. This man is a default person. This whole ordeal was like That 70s Show, but in reverse. That 70s Show was a beloved classic, up until they added the world's most useless character, and then it was all downhill from there. Parks and Rec became a beloved classic after they got rid of one of the world's most useless characters, and then it was all uphill from there. This character is beyond bland. He's offensively dull. I don't think his presence ever really adds anything to the show. Yet so much focus was put on him in the show's first season. He was clearly supposed to be a big deal, as any character who shared screen time with him would be able to tell you.
If there was a Tellinson Award for hooking up with trashy chicks all the time, you'd have several of those awards. You're the king. You're my hero.
But as the show was transitioning into its second season, while Mark's character would largely remain the same, the way others treated him had changed drastically. It's like he was still the same guy, but now the show was aware of what guy he was. The ongoing joke just became that he was boring. Mark went from being irresistible to those around him to becoming irritating to those that knew him. For me, Mark always felt out of place on the show, and nothing done with this character ever felt authentic. It was all very badly handled and forced. I think one of the biggest problems with this character is that the actor doesn't seem to have chemistry with anyone on the cast. The guy just doesn't fit in. I don't buy any of the relationships that he has. I don't buy women being super into him. I don't buy the guys envying him. I just don't buy him. And if I did buy him, I would really hope that he came with a receipt, because I'm taking him back. And while the part was acted well enough, I guess, the performance just didn't match what they originally were going for. Because I don't look at this guy and think womanizer. I look at him and think, hey, he's probably a good dad. Probably takes his kid to the park every Saturday or Sunday, plays catch with them. But this isn't the guy I expect to see at bars picking up. The character just seemed like he was at odds with the show, and the depiction of the character seemed like it was at odds with the description of the character. The following season would turn his Achilles heel to his greatest strength, and played deeply into the character's non-personality. But unfortunately, acknowledging the problem isn't the same thing as solving the problem. And he would waddle on in obscurity on the show, feeling less and less integral to the plots at hand, eventually leading to the character's inevitable departure from the series altogether. I don't often celebrate characters walking off into the abyss, but a thank you is in order, so I thank you for that. The one character who was completely saved from retooling was April. She managed to remain the same dead-inside, awkward, sarcastic psychopath that was presented in the first season. and any changes that occurred to the character over time happened naturally as she was evolving through her relationships with other characters, which is a far cry from what was done with characters like Mark, Andy, or hell, even Leslie and Anne. Because in their cases, their failure to resonate with an audience led to creative reworking their characters entirely. On top of the main cast missing the mark, I find myself mainly missing a lot of the cast. Yeah, sure, series leads like Ben and Chris are sorely missed, as they won't show up until late in Season 2, early in Season 3, but I'm not even talking about them specifically. Unfortunately, most of the show's strange side characters have yet to be created, so at times the town of Pawnee feels entirely vacant. No John Ralphio and Mona Lisa Saperstein schemes. No appearance from any of Ron's evil ex-wives, all of which are named Tammy. No TV show host running around trying to ruin Leslie's public image. None of Councilman Jam's inappropriate-ness. And no Bobby Newport and his Bobby Newport-ness. Season 1 Pawnee really lacked personality. The structure of the show is also lacking a bit here as well. In comparison to the later seasons, it's much slower paced here. And the fact that these episodes are so stretched out, it just makes it that much more painfully obvious and evident that there's not a whole lot going on in them. And there's a part of me that wants to talk about how this season didn't have a whole lot of character development. But then again, this season didn't have a whole lot of characters to develop. It just feels like overall there's substantially less in the show's first season. Less episodes, less things happening in these episodes, less reason to watch these episodes. The one saving grace of this season, I think, is when seeds are being planted, when this show is alluding to the future seasons of the show. And I don't know if this foreshadowing was by coincidence, or mistake, or design, or maybe me trying to fit a square peg into a star opening, but it's one thing I feel really works. Ron mentions his ex-wife Tammy, who will later make a few appearances on the show. There are instances of both Mark and Tom hitting on Anne, which makes sense, as both Tom and Mark would later date Anne at different points in time. But most importantly, and maybe it's because I'm watching with hindsight eyesight, that's entirely possible, but it almost feels like you can physically see April developing a crush on Andy. It's not so much the way that she looks at him, as it's the way that she doesn't look at him.
However you want to look at it.
When she's reacting to the world around her, it's with disgust and annoyance. But whenever she reacts to Andy, she doesn't seem to have that same frustration. Usually she's either smirking his stupidity off, or is in favor of his bizarre behavior. They don't spend a whole lot of time with each other this season, but knowing where they'd end up, it certainly makes me pay more attention to the two of them when they do interact. So that could entirely be me looking too much into it. In hindsight, it's obvious that Parks and Rec's first season was a miscalculation, which is why the next two seasons of the show were just the creators frantically rechecking their math. If you needed any more proof that this first season was a failure, then take into account that all of Season 2 and most of Season 3 were a complete transition from the show first presented to the show would become famous for being. Old characters leave, new characters enter, relationships are ended, new relationships spring. I don't want to get into too much detail here, mainly because that seems more appropriate in the next video of the series. In short, I'll say this. From Season 1 to Season 2, the entire show was restructured, and it needed to be. When it comes to Parks and Recreation, there's something to be said for the statement, first is the worst. Season 1 is Parks and Recreation at its all-time worst.
The worst! The worst in the world.
But even with saying that, the season isn't horrendous or awful. It's just, It's not laughably bad or anything, it's just mostly mundane, with a couple good zingers here and there. Imagine the US Office at its most tame, and that is the first season of this show. It's really interesting to see how a beloved show that lasted 7 seasons could manage to find such success after such a bad first impression. For perspective, every season of the show had averaged at least an 8.1 rating, except for the first season of the show, which averaged a 7.3. And shockingly, the show's pilot is considered one of the worst episodes in the entire series run. As a matter of fact, on most lists of the worst episodes of Parks and Recreation, you'll find not just a couple, but every episode from the first season. This is far from a hot take. Anyway, for my money, Parks and Recreation's first season is the worst season. Not only for what it lacks in quality, but also for what it lacks in terms of a personality. It's clear that at the time they didn't have a really specific direction. And I think if they didn't change course, it probably would have ended a lot sooner than it did. And it would also be a lot less fondly remembered today. Now granted, this season isn't awful. It has its moments, but it definitely comes up short when compared to the rest of the series. What the downfall and then rise of Parks and Recreation tells me is that those in charge weren't afraid to fail. And much more importantly, they were very capable of learning from their mistakes. Because this show started out pretty bad, but it got good. And not just good, but great. It managed to jump from one side of the quality spectrum to the other flawlessly. While I highly recommend checking out Parks and Recreation, I actually recommend staying away from the first season of the show. I don't just suggest not watching season 1 because it's lackluster, but also because I think it's a piss-poor representation of the show itself, with an introduction to characters who don't act like or feel like the characters they'd later become. If you were looking to see what Parks and Rec was all about, then this really wouldn't be an ideal introduction. As a matter of fact, I think watching the show chronologically somehow might be more confusing. Look, your best bet is to go in starting at season 2, ending at season 7, and then, and only then if you're really feeling curious and you really need more of your Rex fix, then go back and watch the first 6 episodes. It's not really a necessity. You can skip right ahead to 2 and there's not a whole lot that you'd really be missing. Season 2 quickly catches you up with the cliff notes of season 1. So, unless you're a completionist, I don't really think it's worth the watch. But if you thought this video was worth the watch, and you too want to see more Parks and Recreation content on the channel, let me know in the comment section below by leaving a comment saying,
I fell in the pit. You fell in the pit. You're falling in the pit, yeah.
Anyway, with all that being said, I was your least favorite YouTuber, Infuso, and I thank you for watching. Hope to see you in the next one.
Yeah, we were just talking about how cool you guys were.
Really?
You were?
Hey there, it's me, your least favorite YouTuber, Infuso. And today, I'm taking a look back at one of my all-time favorite TV shows, and one of my all-time least favorite times on that TV show. I'm talking about It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, Season 1. Now, the show's first season is a little bit different from the ones that would follow, which should be obvious as it's missing one of its main cast members. But I think outside that very, very noticeable absence, this show still feels like the show that it's known for. It's just a little less polished and the characters are a little bit less awful. But what rewatching this first season tells me is that from the very beginning, this show never held back. The very first episode is about the gang addressing their own racism, during which Charlie drops the N-word. And that's the show's pilot. That was what their first impression on an audience was. This is how the show originally wanted to be seen. The following episode has a kid in the gang's care get drunk to the point of puking. Then the episode after that has a bunch of high schoolers become temporary bar regulars, with the gang encouraging them to drink and involving themselves in their teenage angst-filled lives. The episode after that, Charlie's lying about having cancer, and then the one after that, they're tackling gun control. Then they find out that Dennis and Dee's grandfather was a Wolfenstein. And then in the final episode of the first season, 2 of the gang's old classmates falsely accuse an ex-gym teacher of the unimaginable. This is the worst possible impression of this show, and I mean that in the best possible way. It's Always Sunny presented itself warts and all. As a matter of fact, it was mostly warts. They weren't glamorizing the awfulness of their leads, they were highlighting it. They didn't suddenly gain the courage to be offensive over time, because they were shocking people right out of the gate. The show's first season feels a little bit underdeveloped, at least when it comes to certain aspects. Don't get me wrong, the comedy is unapologetically hilarious, and it typically comes at the expense of all of its leads. The storytelling, even when there isn't that much of a story to tell, is always entertaining. In certain aspects, the show excelled from the start, but it's the characters themselves that don't feel like they're perfectly planned out. In terms of the characters' depictions, they're largely the same, if not significantly toned down. Charlie's always at a 12, but during this season, it feels more like he's kind of at a 2. They establish very early on his love of the unnamed waitress, and while it's immediately shown to be one-sided and excessive, it hasn't quite yet become the over-the-top obsession that would become Charlie's primary reason to exist. In the first season, yeah, sure, Charlie's a little wacky, but he definitely hasn't met the level of insanity the character's now known for. Overall, his actions this season don't feel entirely out of character, but he does come off much calmer than usual. Season 1 Charlie is like Charlie on Quaaludes, as opposed to regular Charlie, who acts like he's on. This Charlie is much more neurotic than he is chaotic. I also think the first season portrayal of Mac and Dennis make the characters come off like they were one part split into two. They act very similar, and there's not a whole lot of development made to differentiate the two. Actually, there's nothing at all that makes them particular or distinct. I'm not ragging on either actor, as I think they both do well in their parts. This is just to say that they were playing the same part, and because of this, the show seems a little bit unsure of what the overall dynamic between the two is. Leading to a couple of times in the season where Mac uncharacteristically bosses around Dennis, as opposed to it being the other way around. But I think the biggest example of unsurety has to be the case of Sweet D. This first season almost feels like the character was just put around to meet some kind of a quota.
I'm the brains, you're the looks, Charlie's the wild card, and Frank is the muscle.
Well, what's D?
She's the useless chick.
Oh!
Yeah!
She doesn't get a whole lot to do, and she's the one character in a sitcom that's not really allowed to be funny. Her sole purpose on the show initially was to oppose fun. It's weird now seeing Dee being the often overlooked and underheard voice of reason, knowing that she'd later go on to become the shouting voice, lacking all reason. It's kind of funny in hindsight knowing that the show was setting Dee up to be the most sensible of the bunch, when now she's arguably the worst one out of all of them. Regardless, Caitlin Olsen turns in a good performance here. She does good with what she was given, but she wasn't given all that much. And it's not until the final 2 episodes of the first season that it starts to feel like Dee is broken through the mold of being the useless chick. On one hand, the fact that we see a much better Dee at the start of the series does kind of play well into the overall degeneracy of the gang. If you wanted to, you could see this as the gang's negative influence on those they come in contact with. They essentially corrupted Dee and brought her down to their level, though on the other hand, it would have been nice if this was, or at least was treated as if it was a planned plot. I would have appreciated the show actually emphasizing Dee meeting her breaking point, before inevitably conforming to the gang's narcissistic delusions. Nonetheless, I think it's a really interesting theory and does at least make some semblance of sense when taking into account how drastically this character would change from Season 1 going into Season 2. What I've always loved about It's Always Sunny is its world building. It's the perfect amount of rewarding fan service to binge watchers, while not being too over the top to alienate a first-time viewer. You never know what character's gonna come back into the fold or when or how. Case in point, you have people like Michael Rosenbaum who show up this season, and it's a one-off appearance. He's never heard from again. But then you have characters like Carmen, Mac's transgender would-be girlfriend, who shows up here, and then shows back up during Season 3, and then again in Season 6. Charlie's creepy Uncle Jack would show up in the first season, and then not show back up again until Season 4, at which point he becomes a reoccurring role. The character of Artemis shows up in the first season as well, and she shows up in many episodes after. But then you have characters like Wang, Charlie's landlord, who would make his first appearance this season, and then not show back up for another 8 seasons after this. So like I said, you really never know what to expect with this show. This character could very well be a one-off, and in most shows they probably would be, but here their services could be utilized somewhere in the next 2 decades from now. And if you didn't see the episode that introduced them, the show tailors itself in such a way that it doesn't matter. It's not going to impair your understanding of the plot, and you're not going to be confused as to what's going on. But if you did watch it, and you did know the character, then you're pleasantly surprised, and maybe that much more invested in what's currently going on. The same goes for references made on the show. In the first season, a guy the gang used to go to school with, named Tim Murphy, is mentioned in passing. 7 seasons later, that character would make his first and only appearance on the show.
Tim Murphy slept with your prom date. Tim Murphy slept with your prom date.
Ronald McDonald slept with your prom date. Did he tell you that I slept with her? I never would have slept with that chick. She was gross.
She was gross.
It's Always Sunny always pays attention to itself. They follow the strange continuity that they set up to a T, even when there's nobody asking them to. Which is probably why the few times they step outside their own canon and make a timeline error, that much more jarring. We'll get to that episode eventually. I think what becomes clear when watching the first season of the show, as well as the next 2 seasons that would follow, is that a lot of this wasn't planned out. Because some of the gang's major personality traits are missing entirely during the first run. In Season 1, Dee isn't wild, Mac isn't gay, Charlie isn't a cartoon character, and Dennis's sociopathy hasn't ever come into play. So if those traits always have been a part of the character, then at this point in life, he was better at hiding it. But here's the thing. Because these details weren't set at the time, it makes their eventual inclusion feel much more like a natural development. It doesn't feel like these characters are changing over time, it just feels like we're getting to know them better through the passage of time. The more time that we, the audience, spend with these insane individuals, the more we come to realize that these are not the type of people we'd like to know outside a TV screen. When we're first introduced to the gang, we don't know them intimately. We're just getting acquainted with them. And sure, we could see a couple of cracks in the proverbial pavement, but they're easy to look by in passing. But now, we're 17 years into this relationship, and that metaphorical marble is just completely broken. I actually think that in this case, this is a negative that doubles as a positive. Because it makes the journey of seeing these characters devolve into the characters that they are today much more interesting. The events of the show almost occur naturally, as they're not predetermined in some kind of grand scheme or all-around master plan. A lot of these episodes feel like they were just throwing whatever creative ideas they had at the wall and finding what stuck. What doesn't stick is forgotten, and what does stick is further developed. So in that aspect, there are some brief glimpses into the lives of these characters. Mac vaguely alludes to his religious beliefs, which will later, of course, become a major part of the character in future seasons. The gang's past high school popularity is brought up, something that the show's canon will later dispute, and a whole mess of other things that, quite frankly, I don't want to spoil for you here. The first season really did set the precedent that no topic was off limits. There was no place this show would not go. They were bold in terms of direction, and strictly from a comedic standpoint, this show was on point. I will say that having been spoiled by the rest of the show's run, the first season does feel like a little bit of a letdown. The characters weren't yet defined, the show was clearly shot on a budget, and it does feel like it's missing one of its core elements without Frank. However, if you're not familiar with the show, then I'd like to think that the first season is actually the perfect introduction to it. It's like the gateway into what the show would eventually become. I think the show's first season showed incredible potential, but in the grand scheme of the series' run, it's probably the worst. By no means is it bad, but in comparison to where this show raised the bar, it just doesn't measure up. Though I will say, as different as this season is, it does still feel worthwhile. This is the first step on the show's extended stairway to success, and it's all uphill from here in terms of quality. And I just want to reiterate, just because the first season of It's Always Sunny is the worst season of It's Always Sunny in Philly, doesn't mean that it's a bad season of It's Always Sunny in Philly. As a matter of fact, I think that had this show ended with these 7 episodes, they would still find a cult-like fan base. Season 1 of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia isn't bad. It's just basic. Season 1 of the show does still feel like the show, but it feels like the show lacking all of its substance. The truth of the matter is that Season 1 is still good. It's just nowhere near as good as it gets. So if you enjoyed this video and want to see more It's Always Sunny in Philly content here on this channel, let me know in the comment section below by leaving a comment saying,
So you're throwing down life lessons now,
I'm throwing down eggs!
With all that being said, I was your least favorite YouTuber, Infuso, and I thank you for watching. Hope to see you in the next one.
That little prick's going to hell.
Oh, God, get me out of here. What a mistake. What made me think this would work? I've got nothing left to say. Wait, I've got one.
Hey there, it's me, your least favorite YouTuber, Infuso. And look, I'm gonna be honest with you. I'm really not that much of a Seinfeld fan. Not because I dislike the show or anything, but more so because I've never really sat down to give it a real chance. I've seen episodes that I've liked before, heard jokes in passing from the show that have made me laugh, and seen it referenced a million times over. but I've never really watched the show start to finish like so many people in my personal life tell me I should. So I figure why not start now? And in watching the show's very first season for the very first time, there was only one thought that crossed my mind. And that was, this sucks. And I don't mean the show, necessarily, but this season of this show, it just sucks. It is not great. And I decided to take to the internet to find out if I was the only one with that opinion. But lo and behold, the vast majority of places actually list Seinfeld's first season as being Seinfeld's worst season. A pattern that we're all too familiar with here on this channel, as it wasn't that long ago, just a week as a matter of fact, that we confirmed the same exact thing about both Parks and Recreation and It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, which ironically enough is often referred to as Seinfeld on crack. And even earlier than that, we spoke about how the first season of The Office was the most lackluster as well. Why are so many great shows' first seasons not as good? Why are so many shows off making terrible first impressions? Why does it seem they're at their all-time worst when people are being introduced to them? Well, there are a couple reasons for that. The most blatant being that at this point in the show's run, it just doesn't know what it is at the time. Like human beings, a show's first couple years are their developmental years. And in the case of Seinfeld, it had a lot to further develop. Case in point, the show was originally titled The Seinfeld Chronicles. But what's really interesting about all this is that while the first season of Seinfeld is significantly different from the rest of the show, the first episode of Seinfeld is significantly different from anything of the rest of the season. Even some of the show's most basic points and premises are still yet undefined and undecided. The main hangout of the series is Monk's Cafe. You'll probably remember it as being where a lot of the show's most memorable back and forths have gone down. But in the first episode, the cafe has been replaced by Pete's Luncheonette. And also missing in action is Elaine, completely absent to match the crew's chaotic energy, while also bringing a female perspective to their normally abnormal antics. And in her place is the Luncheonette's waitress, Claire. Claire would listen to the guys' problems when she took their orders. However, unfortunately for them, her giving a shit isn't exactly on the menu. Funnily enough, both the waitress and her place of employment were only ever incorporated into the pilot episode, and they are never heard from again within the rest of the series. Elaine's eventual emergence in the second episode adds new energy to the show, but even in saying that, it's nothing compared to a lot of what she'll do later. She's definitely a welcome addition, but in the larger picture, she's much more toned down here than she'd be in later seasons. You're not really diving into the character, instead this is a little bit of a dip your toe introduction. I don't think they had the full premise of her character and what they would do with her. Similarly, the character of Cosmo Kramer certainly wasn't finalized in his first appearance on the show. Not only does he not look like the same character, but he's not even referred to as Kramer, or Cosmo for that matter. In the first episode, he's called Kessler, and he's a bit more mild and tame from the character in its prime, but there's definitely a spark there. George is a bit different too. He's substantially more stable in this season than he'd become in later seasons. He almost comes off as like a Woody Allen type, with just how nervous and nebbish he is. He's not yet fanatical and prone to outburst at annoyance. The one character who largely feels the same is the titular character Seinfeld. Jerry is the same exact character start to finish on the show. From the pilot to the finale, it's just Jerry. He is the same extraordinary, beyond boring everyman that I don't even care enough to finish this sentence for. And look, I don't know how fans of the show feel. I don't know if this is a common held belief. Again, I've never been a part of this fandom, but Seinfeld the person was always my least favorite part of Seinfeld the show. I did not care about him. You know, I always liked Kramer. He was always funny to me. And the older I get, the more funny I find George. Used to love watching Elaine lose it. Even now, I'm a huge fan of Larry David, but I never really cared for Jerry. Wasn't a Jerry Seinfeld guy. And it doesn't help matters that he would later in life go on to make the B-movie, which is the bane of my existence. Anyway, a lot of the first season feels like it's unsure of itself. There's a bit of uncertainty there. And that makes sense, as even casting wasn't down to a T just yet. During this season, Jerry's father is played by a completely different actor who portrays the character completely differently. Here he's much more laid back and relaxed and surprisingly helpful. A very obvious contrast to the man he'd one day become. The first Morty isn't bad by any means, but he's not exactly written to make an impression.
One thing I really need to highlight here, I'm really glad that these stand-up bits that they emphasized in the first season go on to be toned down significantly. I think when done right, they're a cute little quirk that kind of comes with the show. You know, it's like it's a little signature, just a pleasant little indicator of what it is you're watching in case you somehow forgot. I think it's fine in practice throughout the rest of the season, but in season 1, I was through with it. It did seem a little excessive in what they used from Seinfeld sets, but more importantly, it felt unnecessary and really annoying. It's unfortunate because these segments seem to be plopped in at random intervals of runtime, and I think it does more to distract those watching from the plots rather than endear an audience to the product. And usually, these tidbits aren't anywhere near as funny as the show seems to think they are.
No, think about it. The washing machine is the nightclub of clothes.
Oh,
You know, it's dark,
brother,
there's
this
bubbles
guy
happening.
stinks!
These would become used less and less by the show as time went on, until eventually they were dropped altogether when Larry David exited the series. And because of the emphasis that's put on them, I get the feeling that Jerry's job as a comedian was supposed to be the hook of the show, but it wound up just eventually becoming a background fact. So all in all, the first season of Seinfeld feels exactly like what it is. A first season of a show. I feel like this season's struggles mainly come from the product trying to figure itself out. The characters' personalities haven't been mapped out just right just yet. They're still missing a lot of their key personality traits. And even more unfortunate than that, it's clear the cast doesn't yet have the chemistry that they'd become famous for having. They just didn't have things down to a formula yet. This season is almost painful to watch. And it's not because it's bad. It's just mostly because it's nothing. This works as an introduction to the characters, I guess, but outside of introducing the audience to the show itself, I don't really feel like anything was accomplished. I know the joke about the show is that it's a show about nothing, but what's great about Seinfeld is that it was able to take the mundane and turn it into something entertaining. But I don't know that they did that here. It kind of just feels like they took the mundane and then they put a camera on it. I think if you're watching Seinfeld, then this handful of episodes is probably easy to skip. And I don't think anyone's going to blame you if you do. But they're also not insultingly terrible. They aren't somehow a mockery to the show itself, but they're definitely not making anyone's top 10 lists anytime soon. Now what I want to emphasize here, that I probably should have emphasized in the previous worst season videos, is that if your first season is your worst season, you're golden, pony boy. The idea is to get better with time, to progress in an upward fashion. So ideally, your first attempt should be your worst attempt. So in that vein, I would say Seinfeld was very successful, as were the shows that I spoke of before. Obviously, the show would improve drastically over time, but it was pretty clear to me, even watching this first season, that it was learning fast. This season got better and better episode by episode, and by the time it hit the last 2 episodes of the season, the show is now starting to resemble the show that I remembered watching. I mean, by the end of episode 5, Elaine is matching her co-star's comedic chops, George is slowly turning into Larry David, Kramer is close to becoming the highlight of every episode he's in, and his over-the-top mannerisms have now finally met his over-the-top statements, and Jerry Seinfeld, well, Jerry Seinfeld is still Jerry Seinfeld, unfortunately. Although if I have to say one positive thing about the man behind the B-movie, I will say, I enjoy watching the guy be a giant nerd and put Superman in everything that he does.
He's got super strength, super speed. I'm sure he's got super humor.
I don't think that, but either you're born with a sense of humor or you're not.
That's why the first season of Seinfeld is the worst season of Seinfeld. And if you like this video and want to see more Seinfeld content here on this channel, then let me know in the comment section below by leaving a comment saying,
Superman can go back in time?
We went over that.
With all that being said, I was your least favorite YouTuber, Infuso, and I thank you for watching. Hope to see you in the next one.
I am vengeance. I am the night, and that was Infuso. Just remember, if you're not tuning in, then you're missing out.
So, if you like the words that came out of his mouth hole, and you too would like to become a V-generate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, nerds!
And if you're not joining the fun, you're in for one bad day. And you know what they say about having one bad day?
Catch him next time. Same bat time, same bat channel.